Who the hell's that guy?
Whatever, I got one down.
Drop some dirt on it, you will live.
Yeah, this guy's playing win.
Come on.
One more full base coming. Yeah.
No.
There's one left. It's 1v1. It's 1v1 now.
You got a gas mask?
He does. He's right there. Right in front of him. Oh, yeah.
Holy crap, this guy.
It's a bit of a yearly tradition for me to do a CoD multiplayer beta impressions video, and 2022 was no different with MW2. As someone who thought MW19 was the best CoD game in a decade, my thoughts were mostly positive, though I did find some changes to be a bit aimless. Now that the game has been out for a while, I can tell you that the campaign is a pretty solid follow-up to 2019, but the core multiplayer experience is just not as compelling and certainly doesn't have the legs that 2019 did. The map selection is mediocre and sparse, with one map even being removed due to legal issues, and while I respect the decision to take the gameplay in a slower, more tactical direction, it overall doesn't feel as holistically conceived as 2019 did. That's not to say that I hate the game. I wouldn't have spent tens of hours playing if that was the case, but it was clear to me even in the beta that almost all of the new mechanics and gameplay tweaks, such as swimming, diving, and third person, were done with Warzone 2.0 in mind, rather than the core multiplayer experience. Because of that, I was somewhat anticipating 2.0's release, if for nothing other than to see if my suspicion was correct, and if that design gamble would pay off. I might be in the minority on this, but I think it did, and crazier yet, I didn't stop playing, and I've now played more Warzone than MW2, something I never would have imagined. You have to understand that I'm the furthest thing from the target demographic for a game like this. Aside from the early PUBG days in 2017 and 18, I haven't touched any of these battle royale games for more than an hour or two, because they're just not for me. As much as I respected the original Warzone from day one due to its rock-solid core gameplay and fresh twist on the Battle Royale formula, even that was not enough to get me invested in a post-PUBG BR game. So I think it's super interesting that I'm addicted to 2.0, and furthermore, every single thing I didn't like about MW2 multiplayer is a strong point for me here. This is the first BR to return to that early PUBG experience where the game is a level playing field and anything can happen. Now that's not to say that it's fair, because it's not. The shrinking zone mechanic can hand you an all but guaranteed win or immediately doom your chances. That is inherently not fair, just like all BRs. What I'm instead saying is that I've won matches of 2.0 with random teammates, sometimes with no verbal communication, with weapons I picked up off the ground after a fresh respawn minutes before the match ended. There is only so much advantage you can gain over other players in 2.0, and none of it seems to have anything to do with sweaty, advanced movement exploits or spending 1,000 hours in an aim trainer. Everyone actually has a chance and is working with the same tools. This is such a bold move for a game as mainstream as CoD, and flies in the face of basically every other shooter to come out in the past few years. I talk about it a lot, but I feel like these games are catering to this overly represented 1% of the audience, streamers and esports players, instead of being made for fun. It used to be that after the games came out, they got balance patches that sucked out every ounce of fun in hopes that streamers and esports jocks would stop complaining, which of course they never do. Lately, it seems like those considerations are actually being taken into account during the design phase, and you see it destroy a game like Halo Infinite. Why do I hate this? Because they're making every game the same, so these guys can jump in with no friction. That's how you attract them, by making your game an identityless aim trainer. Look at Halo, a game known for its diverse sandbox of weapons that all handle extremely differently. Play Infinite, and you instead find an overly redundant selection of weapons that are mostly hit-scan precision, which I intensely bemoaned in my review last year. It was clear from the second I played the MW2 beta that this was not the case here. Guns feel distinct from one another, especially between classes, and the recoil and damage fall-off models are more noticeable than they've ever been in any CoD game. The RPK is super strong and probably has too much range when configured properly, but it's slow, it takes time to get it up and aim, and I've died from that plenty of times. Meanwhile, the Vector is an almost insta-kill at close range, but it falls off insanely fast and it's easy to miss your shots. Aside from the weapons, the slowed down, more nuanced pace of just about every action in the game adds another layer of skill that goes beyond who can shoot each other better. Reloads are kind of slow and plating can't be done while running. This means that a certain amount of downtime has to be accounted for in between or even during engagements, and your timing and decision-making on that can be just as or even more significant than your gunplay skills when it comes to winning a fight. It completely dispels this pervasive idea of raw aim as the only metric of skill, and it's so refreshing to me because of that. I agree with the sentiment that this more tactical flavor of gameplay is a bit at odds with the more mindless nature of standard CoD multiplayer, but it's a perfect fit in Warzone, which is ultimately a survival game where there should be pressure, more factors at play than arcade shooter mechanics.
Got another one down. Very weak. Sorry, and they smoke me. What's up? Yeah, yes, sir. Easy money.
When it comes to these battle royale games, I think the main design trade-off you have to make is level of investment. You either have a super slow and long game like old school PUBG that can be really rewarding in late game but equally devastating if you die, or go super fast ADHD where losing doesn't feel that bad but late game and winning isn't as exciting. Warzone 1 was revolutionary with its gulag and buyback concepts, which made death potentially only an inconvenience rather than a permanent punishment. Overall, though, I would describe the pace of Warzone 1 as quite fast, and its investment level as not much deeper than a multiplayer match. However, with 2.0, I feel as if they've managed to capture the strengths of both a faster and slower game. With the core gameplay, we have something that's slower, more involved, like PUBG, but at the same time, the amount of looting and preparation required to be able to handle fights is not that severe, and getting your loadout, while a definite advantage, is not required to have a fighting chance. This is why I keep coming back to the game. When I lose, I don't get super frustrated because I don't feel like I lost a ton of progress. But mid to late game, the gameplay shifts into this more tactical style, a lot like those old PUBG days, and it's way deeper than an extended multiplayer match. People have been talking about how frustrating the game is, but I don't really see anything you could point to as being exploitable or cheap in this. I've even seen a few say that it's pandering to casuals, but to me, it actually feels hardcore in its moment-to-moment gameplay and mechanic design, more unforgiving and less predictable. At the same time, everyone has a chance, anyone genuinely trying could win, and that's what Battle Royale should be. I understand that these are conflicting things to say, but it's how PUBG felt to me back in the day, and why I had so much fun with it. Never when I play this game do I have to worry that my opponent is some streamer that knows like a dozen movement exploits and button combos that I have no hope of competing against. When I play this, it feels like the game is the game. Take it or leave it, and I love that brutal evenness, that stripped back nature. Now, do I think everything is perfect? Definitely not. At launch, there were a surprising amount of technical issues, and even now you'll still experience things like glitched loot and lobbies with server-side lag, which is incredibly annoying and shocking to see in a game as high profile as this. The map is also not a highlight if you ask me. It's pretty monotone, with really no standout interesting areas and a little too much dead space for my liking. I think Verdansk was better even as someone who barely played on it. Then we have this issue of weapon leveling, which is a problem with MW2 in general. There's all these attachments that are interchangeable with different weapons, and the unlocks are somewhat randomly tied to all the different weapons that exist in the game, many of which are unlocks themselves. It's one thing to have to trudge through all these unlock trees of often undesirable weapons just to get attachments, but when it's combined with the hyper-aggressive skill-based matchmaking in multiplayer, it becomes downright infuriating. I'm already getting put into these lobbies that are more competitive than the Super Bowl, and now I have to contend with using subpar weapons with no attachments on them. Now that I'm primarily playing Warzone and pursuing these unlocks exclusively for Warzone builds, it's a completely unwelcome chore, and easily my biggest gripe with the game as it stands. Maybe the fact that I love this game and many prominent Warzone 1 veterans don't is proof positive that the shift in design philosophy was a poor business choice. At the same time, I think Halo Infinite can now be declared a failure with certainty, and that game made a very conscious decision to court that esports type of audience. It's up for debate, and as much as I feel this game is being deeply misunderstood and misplayed by many, if you simply don't like it for what it is, I can kind of understand that, especially if you're coming at this after almost 3 years of the old game. I don't think anyone would argue with me about one thing, though. This game is a shining example of defying what is expected of a mainstream competitive shooter in this era. In every aspect, it's slower. Pure gun skill will not carry you, and other gameplay components are just as, if not more, important. You can't steamroll people nearly as much in this game, and there's only so much insider knowledge that a pro can have over a newer or more casual player. No matter how high your skill level, there's a very real sense of vulnerability at all times due to the way it was designed. Whether you like Warzone 2.0 or not, the bigger point I wanted to get at with this is that I don't like the direction the industry is heading in with its multiplayer FPS games. After 2 years of phoned-in CoD games, the worst Battlefield entry potentially ever, and a Halo game that feels like the death knell for the franchise, I can't stand to see another hyper-homogenized game where the designers were walking on eggshells trying to please a demographic that may or may not be representative of the actual player base. I get that these are super mainstream shooters, but you don't have to go back that far to see that it doesn't have to be this way. I am desperate to see more games that were intentionally designed to be the way they are, something that is authentically and unapologetically the way it is, rather than something that is trying to be everything to everyone, yet failing to be anything to anyone. 2.0 in its launch state feels like that uncompromised experience to me. Clearly, there was a very conscious decision to take the game in a different direction than the first, and the outcry from those who don't enjoy it has placed Infinity Ward and Raven in an awkward position that a lot of other developers have been facing lately. Anytime a game like this comes out, there is a constant back and forth between the players giving feedback and the developers scrambling to put out patches, creating this ravenous cycle of almost crowdsourced game design. This is simply not sustainable, nor is it conducive to creating compelling design. The expectations for turnaround time seem to become shorter and shorter, while almost all feedback is implemented without contention. And whose feedback is being listened to anyway? Naturally, the loudest voices rise to the top, and that's going to be the big streamers, YouTubers, and esports players whose comments get blasted all over Twitter and clickbait headlines. This development by feedback phenomenon grows stronger each passing year, and now it's like they're co-developing the games in real time. It's not always small changes either. In the case of Warzone 2.0, changing plating and TTK would fundamentally transform this game from what it was intended to be, but I'm sure that's exactly what will happen. I've seen plenty of people complaining about Battlefield 2042 and Halo Infinite. Rightfully so, but what I don't see is anyone addressing this topic. It would be foolish to suggest that this is the only thing damaging these games lately, but I think it is eating them alive. It's certainly the last thing needed. Our current internet-based world is increasingly folding in on itself. Things are too close together. I think we need to bring some boundaries back, and the development of these games is no exception. The now classic games that everyone loves that we all point to, they weren't made in this kind of climate. They didn't get patched after a few weeks because popular commentators didn't like a design element. As someone who is intensely critical of games, I'm not saying that feedback shouldn't be taken into consideration, but we can't have this feedback and patch loop on every game every 5 minutes. At some point, people have to accept that every game is not necessarily for them, or else we'll never see one of these games have their own voice ever again.